Chapter 20. Will and Halt, separated by about 5 meters so they wouldn't offer a grouped target to the Genevesians, slipped silently into the dead forest. Their eyes darted from side to side, quartering, seeking, going back again as the two rangers ghosted from one piece of cover to the next, searching for that one sight of movement or flash of color that would give them a warning. Will searched from left to center, then back again. Halt went from right to center, then reversed his scan. Between them, they covered the entire 180 degrees from their extreme left and right to their front. Every so often, without creating any predictable pattern, one or the other would spin suddenly to check their rear. They had progressed some 40 meters into the forest when Halt found a larger than normal piece of cover. A tree had grown with multiple trunks, and now it provided enough protection for the two of them. There were also 2 other features in the topography close to the tree that had taken his attention. Checking their back trail and finding it clear, he gestured for Will to join him. He watched approvingly as his former apprentice slid between the trees, taking full advantage of every piece of cover. He seemed to be a blur, never clearly visible, even to Halt's trained eyes. They crouched together behind the spreading trunks. Now that they were within the forest, Will realized that the trees had a sound of their own. Normally, in a densely packed forest, he would expect to hear the gentle sighing of the wind through the leaves, the call of birds, and the movement of small animals. Here, there were no leaves, no birds, or animals. But despite what he had thought earlier, the trunks and limbs moved slightly, groaning and creaking in protest as their dried joints were forced to give by the ever-present breeze. Sometimes one bare limb rubbed against a close neighbor with a cracking, shrieking noise. It was as if the forest were groaning in its death agony. "Ugly sound, isn't it?" Halt asked. "Gets on my nerves," Will admitted. "What do we do now?" Halt nodded to the narrow path that lay through the trunks in front of them. It wound and twisted from side to side as it found its way through the massive gray trunks, but it always returned to its original direction, which was southeast. "I see they're still leaving a clear trail for us to follow," he said. Will glanced in the direction he indicated. He could see a small fragment of cloth trapped on the sharp end of a broken branch. "I see they're not being any more subtle about it," he answered. Both of them kept their voices low, only just above a whisper. They had no idea how close the enemy might be. "No, indeed," Halt agreed. "I've seen plenty of footprints along the way, too. You'd swear they were made by a giant from the depth of them." Will reached down and felt the ground with 2 fingers. The grass was short here among the dead trees, and the ground beneath it was dry and hard. "Not as if it's soft ground, either." "No. This ground dried out many, many years ago. They're doing it intentionally again, letting us know exactly which way they've gone." "And which way they want us to follow," Will said. A faint smile creased Halt's face. "That, too." "But what are we going to do about it?" Will said. It seemed logical to him. If your enemy wanted you to do something, it only made sense to do something else entirely. "We're not," Halt agreed. "I am." Will opened his mouth to protest, but Halt held up a hand to forestall him. "If we seem to be doing what they want, they may grow overconfident, and that could only be good for us." As he spoke, his eyes were scanning the forest unceasingly, searching for any trace of movement, any sign that the Genevesians might be close. "True," Will admitted, "but I—" Once again, Halt's upraised hand stopped him mid-sentence. "Will, we could be in here for days searching for them if we don't do something to make them show their hand. And all the while, Tennyson is getting farther and farther away. We've got to take a risk. After all, we're only assuming that they're here in the first place. What if they've second-guessed us, left all these convenient signs so they'd think we are trying to lure us in, and then hightailed it out of here, leaving us creeping around trying to find them, and wasting hours of daylight doing it?" Will frowned. That hadn't occurred to him, but it was possible. "Do you think they've done that?" he asked. Halt shook his head, slowly and deliberately. "No. I think they're here. I can sense them. But it is a possibility. Behind them, a branch moved with a louder than normal, drawn-out groan of tortured wood. Will spun around, his bow coming up as he did so. Once again, he felt that tight knot in the pit of his stomach as he wondered where the enemy was, when they might show their hand. Halt leaned a little closer, his voice even quieter than before. I'm going to wait an hour or so. We've got a good position here, and we're covered pretty well from all sides. Let's see what they do now that they know we're here. Do you think they'll move? Will asked. No, they're too well trained for that, but it's worth a try. In an hour the sun will be lower and the shadows deeper and longer in here. That will work for us. Them too, Will suggested, but Halt shook his head. They're good, he said, but they're not trained for this way that we are. They're more used to working in cities, blending into crowds. Plus, our cloaks give us a big advantage in here. The colours match the surroundings a lot better than the dull purple they wear. So, we wait for an hour and see what happens. Then what? Then I'll move on again, following the very obvious trail they're leaving. Halt saw Will's quick intake of breath and knew the young ranger was about to protest. He gave him no opportunity. I'll be careful, Will. Don't worry. I have done this sort of thing before, you know, he added mildly, and he was rewarded by a reluctant smile from his apprentice. Did I say something amusing? He asked. Will shook his head, seemed to ponder whether he should say anything, then decided to go ahead. Well, it's just that before we left Redmont, Lady Pauline spoke to me. About you. Halt's eyebrow shot up. And exactly what did she have to say about me? Well, Will shrugged uncomfortably. He wished now he'd decided against bringing this up. She asked me to look after you. Halt nodded several times, digesting this piece of information before he spoke again. Touching to see she has so much faith in you, he paused, and so little in me. Will thought it might be best if he said nothing further, but Halt wasn't going to let the matter drop. I assumed this instruction was accompanied by some sort of statement along the lines of, he isn't getting any younger, you know. Will hesitated just a second too long. No, of course not. Halt snorted disdainfully. The woman seems to think I'm senile. But in spite of himself, he smiled fondly at the thought about his tall, graceful wife. Then he recovered himself and came back to business. All right, let's get down to it. The reason I'm going to go ahead is that I need your movement skills. You're smaller and nimbler than I am, so you've got a better chance at remaining unseen. I'll break cover and move out after them. You wait here for 5 minutes and then circle out to the left there. They should be watching me by then, and if they're as good as you say you are, they won't notice you. He indicated a shallow indentation in the ground, leading to the left. After about 10 meters, a tree had fallen across it, and its massive gray trunk lay at a slight angle to the indentation. These were the two items he'd noticed as he took cover behind the large tree. He'd been looking for something of any kind since they'd entered the forest. Belly crawl along that little gully there, as far as the fallen trunk, then stay behind that and keep going. That should give you at least 30 meters away from here without them seeing you go. With any luck, they should think you're still in here, ready to give me support if they need it. But all the while, you'll be circling out to flank them. Even though we don't know where they are? Will asked, but he was beginning to see the good sense behind Halt's plan. Halt studied the forest in front of them once more, the corners of his eyes crinkled with concentration. They won't be far back from the track, he said. These trees will see to that. It's too hard to shoot accurately through this tangle at any range greater than about 50 meters. More like 30, really. If you work your way around 100 meters to the left, then begin to move parallel to me, you should stay well outside them, and you'll be placed to come up behind them. Will was nodding as he took in the details. It sounded like a good plan, but there was one potential snag. I still don't like the fact that you're going to draw their attention, he he said. Halt shrugged. Can't see any other way to do it. But believe me, I'm not going to be walking along pointing to my chest and saying, "Just put a bolt here, please." I'll be dodging from cover to cover, and the longer shadows will help. You just make sure that if they try to shoot, you're ready to beat them to it. I'm sure I'll be trying to. Will took several deep breaths. In his mind's eye, he could see the situation developing, with him slipping out to flank the Genevesians as Halt moved through the trees. It was a simple enough plan, and that was a good thing. Simple plans usually worked better than complex ones that relied on a sequence of events falling into place. The fewer things that were to go wrong, he'd learned, the better. He imagined one of the assassins rising from cover. Odds were, he thought, they'd have hidden behind a fallen tree trunk. Their crossbows would be better suited to shoot from low-lying cover like that. Unlike a man armed with a longbow, they wouldn't have to rise to their feet to shoot. They'd expose less of themselves than if they had to step from behind a standing tree to make their shot. Halt could see his young friend's mind working and let him think it through. He was in no hurry to move. The shadows weren't long enough yet for his liking, and he could see that Will was assimilating the plan of action, setting it in his mind to make sure there was no misunderstanding. After a minute or two, he spoke again. "We've got several things going for us, Will. One, these assassins won't be familiar with ranger training or our skill levels. If they don't see you leave cover from behind this tree, they'll assume you're still here, and that will give you an edge. Two, they're using crossbows. It'll be relatively short range, so they won't have any particular edge in accuracy. But on the other hand, they won't outrange us. The most powerful crossbows could outrange a longbow, but firing a short bolt or quarrel rather than a longer, more stable arrow, they became less accurate the longer the shot traveled. In the restricted space inside the trees, they'd be on even footing. "They're not using full-power crossbows in any event," Will said. A really powerful crossbow had massive limbs and cord. It was recocked and loaded by use of a two-handed crank set into the butt. It could take several minutes to ratchet the string back for each shot. The Genevesians used a quicker, less powerful version, with a stirrup in the front of the bow. The bowman placed his foot in the stirrup to hold the bow steady, then, using a two-handed tool that hooked onto the string, he would pull it back into the cocked position, using both hands and all the muscles of his back. The range was reduced, but so was the loading time, to around 20 or 30 seconds, and the bowmen had to stand erect during the procedure. They could release their first shots from behind low cover, he realized, but then reloading, they'd be vulnerable to the Rangers' return shots. "They'll have to show themselves after the first shot," he said. Halt pursed his lips. "They may have more than one bow each," he reminded Will, "so don't take chances. But either way, we'll shoot faster than they will." It would take around 20 seconds for the crossbowmen to reload. Then they'd have to aim and shoot again. Will could knock, draw, aim, and shoot in less than 5 seconds. Halt was a little faster. By the time the Genevesian was ready with his second shot, the two Rangers could have more than a dozen arrows in the air, all heading for him. The Genevesians had the advantage of shooting from an ambush, but if they missed with their first shots, the odds suddenly swung in the Rangers' favor. Halt studied the forest around them for the 10th time, moving his head slightly as he faced west. He could see the glare of the sun between the trunks. The shadows were longer now, and visibility among the trees was becoming more and more uncertain. If he left it much longer, they'd be caught inside the trees in the gathering darkness. It was time to move. "All right," he said. "Remember, 5 minutes, then slip out through that gully." Will grinned sardonically. It was more of a dent in the ground than a gully, he thought, but Halt didn't see the reaction. Again, he was studying the forest to the front and sides of their position. He rose from his kneeling position into a half-crouch. "Let's invite these fellows to dance," he said, then slipped silently out onto the path, a green and gray blur that quickly melded into the shadows of the forest.